Welcome to Inside the Philippines. I'm glad you're here. Today's story is a little different from some we've done. No bar in Angeles City. No Tinder match in Manila. This one starts in a rented flat in Essen, Germany, with a 63-year-old man sitting at a kitchen table with a spreadsheet open and approximately $300,000 in the bank, and no idea what any of it was for anymore. His name is Wolfgang. He spent 35 years running a metal fabrication business outside Dortmund. He is the kind of man who double-checks his own work, who keeps records, who does not make decisions without data. He is, by his own description, an engineer in the way he lives his life. And he came to the Philippines with a plan that he was absolutely certain was foolproof. I'll let him tell you what happened to it. Here's his story, in his own words. I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not a stupid man. I say this not to excuse myself. The things I am going to tell you do not have an excuse, but because I think it matters. People hear these stories and they think, well, I would never do that. I would see it. I want you to understand that I thought this too. I thought it right up until I was sitting in Ninoy Aquino Airport with one suitcase and a boarding pass, and I thought it even then a little. I ran a Metallbau firma, a metal fabrication company, in Hürde, which is a district of Dortmund. We made components for the automotive industry, mostly. Brackets, housings, precision-cut structural parts. 12 employees at our peak. My tolerances were known in the region. Other shops would send their difficult jobs to us when their own work came back rejected. I built that from nothing. I started in 1986 with second-hand equipment in a rented unit, and I retired from it 35 years later with a reputation I will admit, proud of. I tell you this because I want you to understand what kind of man I am. I am not someone who makes decisions on feeling. I make decisions on data. I verify. I document. I have kept a household ledger since 1989. Paper, not digital, a green hardcover book one buy from the same shop in Hürde every 3 years. Every significant financial transaction I have ever made is in one of those books. When I built an extension on our house in 1998, I photographed every stage of the construction and kept the photos in a binder with the contractor invoices. This is simply how I operate. My wife Ingrid found this quality of mine both reassuring and, she said once, slightly exhausting. She said it once, and then she laughed. And then she said she was joking, which she probably was not entirely. Ingrid was diagnosed in 2017. Pancreatic cancer, which means, if you don't know, that by the time they find it, you are already in a difficult position. We did not accept this immediately. That is not the right word, accept. We did not stop. I researched oncologists. I found a specialist in Essen, another in Düsseldorf, a third in Hamburg, who had published work specifically on late-stage pancreatic cases. I made appointments. I kept a medical folder, the actual paper kind, with dividers and labeled sections, lab results, treatment notes, second opinions, third opinions. I drove Ingrid to every appointment in 4 years, which is a large number of appointments. None of it mattered. That is the thing about this particular disease. It does not care that you have a system. It does not care that you are thorough. I learned this very slowly and very badly over 4 years. And when Ingrid died in March 2021, I think part of what one was grieving, alongside her, alongside 29 years of a marriage that was not perfect, but was ours, was the belief that if you are careful enough, rigorous enough, diligent enough, the world will behave correctly. This belief had been the foundation of everything. And it was gone. I sold the workshop in October 2021. There was a younger man, Bernd, who had worked for us for 8 years and had been making noises about buying for 2 of them. We agreed on a figure. I sold the house in Hürde 4 months later. The house I had photographed in 1998 when we built the extension. The house where we had lived for 22 years. A family from Dortmund bought it, and I moved into a rented flat in Essen, and I stood in the kitchen on the first evening with exactly nothing to maintain. The flat was clean. It had a small balcony looking at another building's wall. I cooked a schnitzel because I needed to do something with my hands, and then I ate it standing at the counter because sitting at a table alone felt like an announcement of something I did not want to announce. I had, at that point, roughly 290,000 euros, about $310,000 at the exchange rate then. This is more money than most people have. I knew this. I felt no particular way about it. It was simply a number in a column, and the column had no purpose I could identify. I began watching YouTube. I want to say this plainly, because I think it is important. This is how it starts for men like me. Not a brochure. Not a travel agent. YouTube at 2 in the morning, when sleeping is something other people seem to be able to do. I was not watching what you might expect. I was not watching bar girl content or any of that. That was not the life I was looking for, and I think I would have been insulted by the suggestion. What I found, after some weeks of searching, were retirement channels. Ordinary men, mostly my age, showing their daily lives in Southeast Asia. The cost of a meal. The weather in February. A small garden. A local market. A morning coffee on a terrace, with a view that would have cost 10 times as much in Germany. I watched a great deal of content about Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines. I approached this the way I approach any decision. I made a comparison document. A spreadsheet, yes, with columns, cost of living, healthcare access, visa options, English language proficiency, cultural factors. I am aware this sounds cold. It was cold. That was, at the time, the best I could manage. The Philippines came out ahead on several of my criteria. The English is excellent, genuinely excellent, not just tourist area English. The culture is Catholic, which for me as a non-religious man simply meant familiar ethical framework, family-oriented, conservative in the ways that tend to produce stable social environments. And the cost of living was manageable without being so cheap that it would feel like poverty in a warm country, which was not what I wanted. I spent another 3 weeks reading expat forums. I found a dating site called Christian Filipina, which the forums described as being oriented toward serious relationships rather than arrangements, if you understand my meaning. I was skeptical about all of this. I remained skeptical, but I was also 62 years old, living alone in Essen, and the Green Ledger book had nothing in it that needed recording. I joined in March 2022. In the first week, I sent messages to 3 women whose profiles seemed genuine to me. Not professional photographs. Actual information in the bio. Something specific about themselves, rather than general statements about wanting a good man and serious relationship. The first 2 replied within hours, with messages that were clearly not written for me specifically. The third did not reply for 4 days. When she did reply, her name was Marisol, and she asked me a question. Not about my finances, not about whether I was serious. She asked what kind of fabrication work my company had done, because her late husband, she said, had worked in construction, and she had always been curious about how metal components were made for cars. I sat with that message for a while. Then I wrote back. We wrote back and forth for about 2 weeks before she suggested a video call. I want to be precise about that. She suggested it. I have thought about this detail many times since. A woman running a scheme does not suggest video calls. She avoids them, or she uses recordings, or she has someone else sit in front of the camera. Marisol suggested the call herself, on a Wednesday evening her time, and when the connection opened, she was sitting in what was clearly a hospital administration office, still in her uniform, and she said she had just finished a 12-hour shift and apologized for how she looked. She looked fine. She looked tired, actually, which is its own kind of credibility. She was 41, a nurse administrator at a private hospital in Cebu City. She had a daughter, Nika, who was 14, and she mentioned her in passing without making her central to the conversation, which I also noted. Women who use children as leverage tend to introduce them early and in specific ways. Marisol talked about Nika the way a person talks about a fact of their life. She exists. She is here. We can discuss her if you like. Her husband had died 6 years before. A construction accident. Scaffolding failure on a project in Mandaue. She said this without drama. A thing that happened. She had managed since then, she said, not because it was easy, but because there was no alternative to managing. I found her, in that first call, almost uncomfortably familiar. Not in her manner was Filipino, warm in ways that I was not yet calibrated to read correctly, but in her relationship to difficulty. She processed hard things by describing them accurately and moving forward. This is how I also process hard things. Or believed I did. We spoke every Sunday after that. Then Wednesdays also. Then, gradually, most evenings, though briefly. She worked long hours, and I respected this and told her so. And she said she noticed that I did not demand her time, and that this was unusual. I noted that she said this. I wrote it in my notes. Under her name, I had a small document on my computer. Not romantic, just observational. Things she said. Things she remembered. Things that seemed inconsistent, if any appeared. The inconsistency column stayed empty for a long time. In our fourth call, I mentioned Ingrid. Not at length. I simply referenced her in the context of explaining why I had sold the house, and Marisol asked her name. Just her name. Not how she died, or how long we were married, or whether I was over it. Just her name. I told her. She said it back once, quietly, and then she asked me something else entirely. And we moved on. 2 calls later, this would have been May 2022, she asked how I was doing with the anniversary of the diagnosis. I did not immediately understand what she meant. Then I did. She had calculated the date from what I had told her in the 4th call, and she had remembered it, and she was checking on me. I opened my notes document and I wrote, remembers details, calculates, checks. To a man who has kept a green ledger since 1989, this is not a small thing. This is, in fact, exactly the kind of behavior that I had spent 29 years valuing in another person. I am not saying I was not aware of what I was feeling. I am saying I believed I was also being rigorous about it. In June, Nika needed school supplies and textbooks for the new term. Marisol mentioned this in passing, not a request. She said she was figuring out the budget. I asked the amount. She said she did not want to ask me for money. I told her she had not asked. I had. She told me 15,000 pesos would cover it. About 25 euros at the time. Less than a dinner for 2 in Essen. I sent it via Gcash that evening. I opened the green ledger, and I wrote the date, the amount, and a brief description. Philippines, Marisol, school supplies for daughter Nika. Documented. Under control. I want to be honest about something. The amount was not the point. The act of sending it was the point. I had not had anything to spend money on in 14 months that felt like it was for someone, rather than simply for maintenance. The 15,000 pesos was nothing. The feeling of it was not nothing. By July, we were talking every day. Not long calls. She was busy, and I was not the kind of man who needs to be talking constantly. But contact every day. A message in the morning, a call in the evening when she was home, and Nika was doing homework in the next room. She would sometimes call out to Nika during our calls, and Nika would sometimes appear in the frame briefly, polite and slightly shy in the way of teenagers who have been told to be polite. I booked flights in late July. Cebu, not Manila. I had read enough on the forums to understand that landing in Manila and making your way to Cebu adds both time and complication, and the direct connection from Frankfurt via Dubai was straightforward. I told Marisol 2 weeks in advance. She said she was glad. And then she said she was nervous. And I said that I was also nervous. And she laughed, and I found that I had also laughed, which was something I had not done in a call with another person in some time. I arrived at Mactan Cebu International Airport on the 4th of August, 2022. It was just after 7 in the evening, local time, and the heat when I came through the doors was a physical thing. Not unpleasant, just immediate and total. The kind of warmth that gets into your clothes and stays there. There was a smell of aviation fuel and something frying from a food stall somewhere, and the noise of 100 conversations and jeepney horns from the road outside. Marisol was waiting past the barrier. Nika was beside her, holding a small piece of cardboard with my name written on it in careful letters. Wolfgang. I do not know who thought of the sign. I suspect it was Nika's idea. It made me feel, briefly and unexpectedly, like someone arriving somewhere. Marisol looked like her photographs. I had prepared myself for a version of her that was softer or different, or somehow less than the person I had been speaking to for 5 months. This is what the forums had led me to expect, that the reality would be a correction. She was not a correction. She was tired from a long shift she had come from directly, and she shook my hand first, formally, before anything else. And this also, I noted. We took a grab to her parents' house in a barangay outside Mandaue. I sat in the back seat with my rolling case between my knees and watched Cebu City pass outside the window. The SM Seaside Mall lit up along the water, jeepneys painted in colors that had no equivalent in any Dortmund street. A basketball court on the corner of a barangay road where 3 boys were still playing under a single working floodlight at 8 in the evening. I thought, this is a real place. I think I had not quite believed it was until I was in it. Marisol's parents' house was concrete block, single story, with a small covered area at the front where her father, Tatay Ben, was sitting when we arrived. He stood up when he saw me and extended his hand and said, in English, "Kuya Wolfgang, welcome to our home. You are hungry, yes?" I was, in fact, hungry. Nanay Cora had made sinigang, a sour tamarind soup with pork and vegetables, and rice, and she watched me eat it with an attention that reminded me of the way my own mother used to watch guests at the table, checking that the food was adequate, adjusting things. The sinigang was excellent. I said so. Nanay Cora smiled and immediately served me more. There were others there that evening, Marisol's brothers, Ronnie and Edwin, and her sister Danica with her 3 children, all under 10, and all interested in me with a directness that children have before they learn to pretend otherwise. The youngest sat next to me and watched my chopstick technique until I switched to a spoon, and then watched my spoon technique instead. It was a full house, in every sense. Loud and warm and slightly chaotic, and completely sincere. I understood that I was being assessed. A man from Dortmund can recognize a family meeting even when it is disguised as a welcome dinner. and I did not mind this. It was sensible. Marisol's family was doing exactly what I would have expected a careful family to do. I respected it. What I did not yet understand was the weight that comes with being found acceptable. In Germany, when an in-law family decides they approve of you, there is a mild warmth and perhaps an invitation to Christmas. I did not yet know what approval meant here and what it would come to cost. But that evening I ate sinigang and drank a San Miguel from a bottle that was slightly too warm, and watched Tatay Ben tell a long story in a mixture of Cebuano and English about a fishing boat he had owned 30 years ago. And I thought, I have somewhere to be. I had not thought this in a long time. I should have been more careful about how good it felt. I stayed 3 weeks that first visit. I had planned for 2, but I extended by 7 days, which tells you something about the state I was in, though I would not have admitted it at the time. I told myself I needed more time to assess the situation properly. This was not entirely false. Marisol took a week of her annual leave. We went to the Ayala Center in Cebu City one afternoon, a large modern mall that could have been in any European city, except for the Jollibee on the ground floor, and the Christmas decorations already going up in August, which I found both absurd and somehow charming. She bought Nika a pair of shoes. I paid because she reached for her purse, and I told her not to, and the shoes cost 2,200 pesos, about 35 euros. And this was a nothing amount. I am noting this only because it was the second entry in the ledger. The amounts in those first months were so small as to be nearly invisible. This was, I understand now, part of the design. Whether it was conscious design or simply the natural rhythm of how these things develop, I cannot say with certainty. Probably I will never know. We drove one afternoon to the southern part of Cebu, to a small beach near Moalboal. White sand, clear water, extraordinarily blue in a way that German water simply is not. Marisol brought food in a cooler. Rice wrapped in banana leaves, some grilled fish her mother had prepared, cold Sprite for Nika. We sat on the beach and ate, and Marisol talked about her husband for the first time at any length. Not sadly, but thoughtfully, the way a person talks about someone who is gone, but was real. She said he had been a good man who worked too hard and did not complain about anything, and that this quality, she said, had not served him well in the end. I thought about Ingrid. I did not say so. The family obligation, as I now understand it, has a term in Filipino, utang na loob, debt of the inner self. The idea that when someone does something for you, genuinely, generously, from a good place, you carry that as an obligation that does not expire. I did not know this term during that first visit. I encountered the concept without the vocabulary for it, and I interpreted it entirely through a German framework, which was, these people are being gracious, and I should reciprocate appropriately. This seemed correct to me. It was correct, in a way. The problem was that the scale of appropriate reciprocation was something I had no frame of reference for. Tatay Ben asked me one evening, very directly, and without apparent embarrassment, what my plans were. He meant for Marisol, for the family, for whether I was a serious man or a tourist. I told him I was serious, and that I was still in the process of understanding what that meant in practical terms. He nodded and said, in a way that I thought was approving, "You are a careful man." I said yes. He said, "Good. Careful men are dependable." I wrote this down when I got back to my room that night. I thought it was a positive assessment. It was also, I think now, a description of exactly the kind of man they needed. I want to say something about this that I think is important. The warmth in that house was not manufactured. I have thought about this very carefully in the months since, and I do not believe Tatay Ben and Nanay Cora were performing for me. They were not. They were a family who had been poor and had managed, and who had a daughter they were proud of, and who saw in me, a German widower with money and seriousness, the possibility of security for people they loved. This is not the same as a scam. It is a different thing. It is a family doing what families do when they are trying to survive. The fact that it cost me enormously does not make their need less real. I am not sure I have fully worked out the ethics of this. I am still working on it. I returned to Essen in late August. The flat seemed, if possible, smaller than when I had left it. The balcony with its view of the other building's wall. The absence of roosters at 4 in the morning, which is something I had complained about in Mandaue, and now noticed the lack of. Ridiculous. I increased the monthly Gcash transfer to 45,000 pesos, roughly 75 euros, for household expenses. I framed this as practical. Marisol was supporting her parents partly. Nika's school had various costs. It was reasonable to contribute while I was determining my next steps. I opened the green ledger and recorded it as a monthly item. I began a new spreadsheet, not the household ledger, a separate digital file, for what I was starting to think of as the Philippines situation. Income column, expenditure column, notes. I also began researching the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, issued by the Philippine Retirement Authority. For someone my age, over 60, the required deposit was $20,000 held by the PRA, returnable when you leave the country. In exchange, you get permanent resident status, no need to extend a tourist visa every 2 months, various other benefits. It seemed straightforward. It seemed, in fact, like an excellent arrangement. I noted the requirements and began assembling documentation. I visited again in November 2022. 4 weeks this time. I told myself this was still assessment, still due diligence. I was assessing very comfortably by this point. Nanay Cora made adobo the night I arrived, the smell of vinegar and garlic and soy sauce filling the whole house, and Tate Ben poured me a red horse, a stronger local beer, not something to drink quickly, and asked how Germany had been. As if Germany were a place I had briefly visited, rather than where I lived. One evening during that trip, Marisol mentioned in passing that the family's landlord had put up the rental property for sale. The owner was moving to Manila, needed the cash quickly. This was not a request. She said it in the same tone she used to mention that Nika had an exam coming up, or that Tatay Ben needed to see a doctor about his blood pressure. Information. Facts about her life. I asked some questions, which is what I do when I receive information that has implications. She answered them, and somewhere in those answers I heard myself asking about property prices in the barangay. I think about that moment sometimes, the moment when I asked the question. She did not lead me there, or rather, she led me there so gently that the leading was indistinguishable from a conversation. This is either very skilled manipulation or simply how a person describes a problem to someone they trust and see as capable of helping. I have not been able to determine which. Possibly she herself could not have told you. What I know is that I engaged a property lawyer in Cebu City, a recommendation from an expat forum, a Filipino-American woman who had built a practice around exactly this kind of situation. The lawyer confirmed what I had already read. As a foreign national, I could not own land or a house in the Philippines. Condominiums were possible under certain restrictions. Land and residential property were not. The workaround, and she was direct about this to her credit, was to put the title in a Filipino partner's name. She said this plainly, and then she said, "You should understand this means you have no legal claim to the property if the relationship ends." I said I understood. I had known Marisol for 8 months by this point. she had remembered the anniversary of Ingrid's cancer diagnosis without being asked. I was not worried about the relationship ending. We agreed on 1,900,000 pesos for the lot and construction, approximately 30,000 euros at the exchange rate then. I had the lawyer review the land title. Clean. No encumbrances. I visited the construction twice over the following months, once when they were laying the foundation and once when the walls were up. Both times I found things I wanted corrected. A corner not square. Some concrete work that looked thin. I had these addressed. The foreman seemed both mildly annoyed and slightly impressed by this. We got along well enough. The house was finished in early 2023. It was modest. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a covered outdoor area at the back, where Tatay Ben immediately set up a plastic table and 2 chairs. Marisol's family moved in. I had a room designated as mine for when I visited. It had a small desk, which was Marisol's idea. She said she knew I would need somewhere to work. I stood in the completed house on my 3rd visit in March 2023 and looked at the walls and the roof and the floor, checked the joints, ran my hand along the window frames, confirmed that what had been built was what had been paid for, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Utility. The sensation of having applied resources to a problem and produced a result that existed in the physical world and could be inspected. This feeling was, I now understand, the most dangerous thing that happened to me in the Philippines. More dangerous than any specific request, any specific amount of money. Because a man who feels useful will do quite a lot to keep feeling that way. The first medical emergency came 2 months later. Tatay Ben's heart. May 2023. Marisol called me on a Tuesday evening. It was late afternoon her time, and she was composed in the way that people are composed when they have decided to be composed because the alternative is not useful. She said her father had been admitted to Chonghua Hospital in Cebu City. Chest pain, irregular rhythm. The cardiologist was recommending a stent procedure. She had the name of the cardiologist, the ward number, the preliminary cost estimate. She told me these things in order. The stent and the associated hospital costs came to 380,000 pesos, approximately 6,000 euros. She said she was looking at what the family could manage, that she did not want to ask me, that perhaps she could arrange a payment plan with the hospital. I told her to send me the billing estimate. She sent it within the hour. I looked at it on my screen in the Essen flat. It was a real hospital document. Letterhead. Itemized costs. The name of the procedure spelled correctly in the way that real medical documents spell things. I transferred the money the next morning. I want to be precise about my thinking at the time. 6,000 euros was not a trivial amount, but I had 220,000 euros still in the German account, and my state pension, the Deutsche Rentenversicherung, pays me 1,400 euros a month, which in the Philippines goes considerably further than in Dortmund. And I had a spreadsheet that said I was within parameters. Tatay Ben needed a cardiac stent. This was not a luxury. This was a man's heart. I flew out in June to see him recovering. He was sitting in his chair at the plastic table under the covered area, thinner than before, but upright. He shook my hand and said, "You are a good man, Kuya Wolfgang." And I felt, I am going to be honest about this, I felt that it was true, that I was a good man doing a correct thing. This feeling is, I now understand, one of the most expensive feelings a person can have. 3 months later, Ronnie had a motorcycle accident. He was coming back from the industrial zone late at night. A truck pulled out from a side road, and Ronnie went over the handlebars. Broken collarbone, lacerations, 2 nights in hospital. Marisol sent me the emergency room bill and a photo of Ronnie with his arm in a sling looking sorry for himself. 95,000 pesos, about 1,500 euros. I paid it. I noted in my ledger, Ronnie, motorcycle accident, hospital. What I also noted, and then did not sufficiently examine, was that this was the second time Ronnie had called Marisol's phone to speak to me directly about something before Marisol had mentioned it. I thought this was mildly irregular. I thought also that the man had just broken his collarbone, and perhaps regular protocol was not the priority. I did not ask more questions. I should have. But by this point I was sending 45,000 pesos a month, had paid for the house, had covered Tatay Ben's cardiac procedure, and had covered Ronnie's accident, and my spreadsheet showed a total commitment of approximately 52,000 euros over 14 months. I reviewed this figure in September 2023. I recall the exact moment. I was sitting at my desk in the room with the small desk that Marisol had arranged for me, on a visit to Cebu, and I opened the file and looked at the column totals. 52,000 euros. Of 290,000 euros I had started with. This represented roughly 18%. This was, by any financial measure, manageable. My parameters were intact. My parameters, as I have said, were the wrong tool. The third medical situation came in November 2023. Danica's youngest, the smallest child, the one who used to watch my spoon technique at the dinner table, had been diagnosed 18 months earlier with a congenital heart defect, a condition requiring surgical intervention. Danica and her husband had been trying to manage it through medication, but the surgeon was now saying that further delay was not advisable. The surgery at a private pediatric cardiac center in Cebu City. 220,000 pesos. About 3,500 euros. I did not simply send the money this time. I was in Cebu on an extended stay by then, and I accompanied Marisol to the hospital 2 days before the procedure and spoke with the surgeon directly, through Marisol's translation for the technical sections, but I asked my own questions, and I understood the answers. The child's condition was real. The surgery was real. The surgeon was a calm, precise woman who seemed faintly surprised that a German grandfather figure was sitting in her office asking about post-operative care protocols, but she answered everything I asked. The surgery went well. I was in the waiting room when Marisol came out and told me this. She touched my arm briefly, just once, and said, "Thank you." It was the most direct expression of gratitude she had ever offered me, and it was delivered very quietly, in a busy hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, and I simply nodded. Now, there is something I need to tell you about this period, about what I was and was not seeing. One afternoon, Nanay Cora was sitting with me in the outdoor area while Marisol was at work. We were drinking coffee, very sweet, the Filipino style, which I had gradually learned to accept. And Nanay Cora was talking about the family, various things, and she said something that included the word bata, child. And then she said something else, and the sentence shifted direction. And Marisol, who had arrived home early and appeared at the gate at that precise moment, said something to her mother in Cebuano in a particular tone, and her mother stopped talking, and the conversation moved to something else. I did not understand the Cebuano. I caught the word bata and understood it as child, possibly one of Danica's children. Marisol's return seemed coincidental. The subject change seemed natural. I filed it as a data point and continued drinking my very sweet coffee. I think about that afternoon a lot. The way Nanay Cora stopped mid-sentence. I should have asked. I know this. But what question would I have asked? I did not know what I didn't know, And this is a specific problem that spreadsheets cannot solve. By month 18, my total committed figure had reached €72,000 when you included the house, the medical contributions, and the accumulated monthly transfers. I opened the spreadsheet and I looked at this, and I concluded. This is the conclusion I reached, sitting at my small desk in a house in Manila that I had paid for and did not own, that I was within parameters. But there was something else happening around this time that I was also not fully examining. Marisol had started occasionally asking me to send the monthly support through a different account. Sometimes her sister's GCash, sometimes a number I did not recognize, with explanations about GCash transaction limits or about the specific account being more accessible that week. I noted this each time. I transferred nonetheless. I told myself this was a small country with mobile banking infrastructure that was still developing and that various workaround behaviors were normal. This was the moment, these transfers through accounts I could not directly verify, that would, much later, become a serious problem. Not for the reason you might expect, but I am getting ahead of myself. Ronnie came to me that September with a proposal. He approached me at a family dinner. Nane Cora had made lechon for what I cannot remember was supposed to be a celebration of something. The smell of roasted pork and garlic filling the whole house, and the barangay beyond it, and he sat across from me at the table after the meal was finished, and the children had gone to watch something on a tablet, and the others had drifted away, as they seemed always to drift away when Ronnie wanted to speak to me alone, which I also noted and did not ask about. He told me he had identified a business opportunity in the Mandaue industrial zone, a welding supply and small fabrication operation, equipment rental, consumables, some contract work for the construction firms operating in the area. He had visited the site. He had spoken to 2 potential clients already. He had, he said, researched the market. And then he put a folder on the table in front of me. Printed pages. Cost estimates, equipment lists, projected revenue over 12 months, rental costs for the industrial unit, organized, in columns. A man who spent 35 years in metal fabrication knows immediately whether someone understands the industry or is performing understanding of it. Ronnie's numbers were not perfect. His equipment costs were slightly optimistic, and his client conversion timeline was naive. But they were in the correct range, and they reflected actual knowledge of what a small fabrication supply operation requires to function. I sat with the folder for a long time. I asked him for a week to review it properly. He agreed without hesitation. I verified 3 of his equipment quotes by calling suppliers in Cebu directly. They were accurate within 10%. I concluded the figures were realistic. He needed 3,200,000 pesos to get started, about €50,000. Under Philippine law, I could not be a registered business owner. He would be the legal operator. I would be a silent investor. I told him I would do this, and I told him one other thing. I said, I know this business. I will know if the numbers are wrong. He said, I know you will, Kuya. We shook hands. I wrote down what we had agreed. Monthly financial reports, my right to visit the operation, defined return expectations. In a document I gave him a copy of. Neither of us signed it. I did not engage a lawyer for this arrangement. I want you to understand that I knew this was a deficiency. I knew it, and I proceeded anyway, because I had been in that barangay for 18 months, and I had become, without quite deciding to, a man who trusted Ronnie. I also did one other thing that month that I have not yet mentioned. I opened a German bank account, a secondary account, at a different institution from my main one, and I moved €40,000 into it. This was not a plan exactly. It was a habit of mine from the workshop days, keeping a reserve account that the main business cash flow didn't touch, for emergencies only. I did not tell Marisol about this account, not as a precaution against her specifically, just as the kind of privacy that a man who has managed his own money for 35 years maintains without thinking about it much. I did not think about it much. I moved to Cebu permanently in November 2023. Month 20 of knowing Marisol, month 2 of the business investment. I packed what I needed from the Essen flat into 2 suitcases, put the rest in storage, and told the landlord I would not be renewing. I did this with the same methodical efficiency I applied to everything, and I will admit that there was also, underneath the efficiency, something that felt like relief. The flat had never been a home. It had been a place where I slept between decisions. I arrived at Mactan on a Tuesday evening. Marisol at the airport again. No cardboard sign this time, because I was no longer a visitor who needed one. We drove to the house in Mandaue, and Nanay Cora had made pancit for the occasion. Rice noodles with vegetables and pork, traditionally served for long life at celebrations, though I only learned the significance later. And Tatay Ben opened a San Miguel and handed it to me as I sat down at the table and said simply, "Now you are home." I drank the San Miguel and did not examine this statement as carefully as I should have. The tourist visa situation was my next administrative priority. The Philippine tourist visa is issued for 30 days and extendable, but the extensions must be processed every 2 months at the Bureau of Immigration, which in Cebu City means a trip to their office on Osmeña Boulevard, usually a queue, always paperwork, and a fee of roughly 3,000 pesos to 4,000 pesos each time. I did this twice and found it tedious and slightly undignified for a man of my age with legitimate intentions. The SRRV was the correct solution. Permanent resident status, one-time process, done. I had been assembling the documentation since late 2022, and I was now ready to initiate the formal application. I lodged the required $20,000 deposit with the Philippine Retirement Authority, which is held in an escrow arrangement and returned when you exit the country permanently. The application was submitted. I was given a reference number. I was told to expect 3 to 4 months for processing. I noted this in the spreadsheet. I settled into a routine. My room in the house had the desk and a reasonable internet connection. I monitored the business reports from Ronnie, which in those first months arrived with reasonable consistency. Modest figures, a handful of clients, equipment utilization rates that were lower than projected, but not alarmingly so. I visited the workshop in the Mandaue Industrial Zone 3 times over those first months. It existed, a low concrete building on a side street near the port access road. The smell of cutting oil and metal dust that I found, embarrassingly, comforting. 4 employees. A plasma cutter that Ronnie had purchased second-hand, and which I examined carefully and found to be in acceptable condition. Ronnie showed me around with a pride that seemed genuine, and I noted the stock levels and the client job board, and concluded that the operation was functional, if not yet profitable. I also, during these months, became something I had not anticipated. I became a presence in the barangay. Neighbors knew me. The sari-sari store operator at the corner. A small woman named Aling Nena, who sold everything from sachets of shampoo to warm Coca-Cola from a glass-fronted refrigerator that hummed irregularly, called me Sir Wolfgang and gave me a small discount that I suspect was entirely invented to make me feel like a local. Children on the basketball court in the mornings watched me with curiosity, and then, after a few weeks, ignored me, which meant I had been accepted. Karaoke from the house 3 lots over every Friday evening, reliably starting at 8 and reliably featuring someone with genuine confidence in their version of my way. I came to expect it. I came to find the absence of it, on weekends when the family was away, slightly quiet. This is what I want you to understand about this period. It was a life. It was not a pretend life or a temporary arrangement or a series of transactions dressed up as a relationship. It was actual daily existence in a specific place, with specific people, and it had texture and routine and, yes, some version of contentment. I am not certain how much of what I felt was real, and how much was what I had decided to feel, because the alternative, returning to the Essen flat, the balcony, the view of the other wall, was not acceptable. I have not fully resolved this question, but the administrative situation had begun to develop complications I did not immediately understand. The PRA sent a letter in February 2024, month 27, requesting additional documentation related to my financial history. Specifically, they had flagged inconsistencies between the source records for my incoming transfers and the account information I had submitted in my SRRV application. I read this letter several times. I did not immediately understand what inconsistency they were referring to. Then I understood. The transfers I had been routing through various GCash accounts at Marisol's request, her sister's number, the unrecognized accounts, the workarounds for what she had described as transaction limits, had created a financial paper trail that did not align cleanly with what I had declared in my application documents. To the PRA's compliance process, an orderly German retiree whose money arrived through a rotating series of different Filipino mobile accounts looked irregular, perhaps suspicious. They were not wrong to flag it. It was irregular. I had simply not thought about how it would appear from the outside because I had been focused on the inside. My SRRV application stalled. Processing suspended pending clarification. The $20,000 deposit remained lodged but inaccessible. I went to the Bureau of Immigration on Osmeña Boulevard to extend my tourist visa while the SRRV situation was being resolved. There was a problem with the timing. The PRA correspondence had consumed 10 days, during which I had not been tracking my visa extension deadline with sufficient attention. This is not an excuse, it is simply what happened. And I discovered that my visa had lapsed 11 days prior. I was, technically, overstaying. The BI officer was not unkind about this. He was also not flexible. There would be a fine, a specific process. I could not simply extend. I would need to settle the overstay and then reapply. The fine was 500 pesos per day for 11 days plus administrative fees, approximately 12,000 pesos total, about 190 euros, which was not the amount that concerned me. What concerned me was the notation on my record and what it might mean for the SRRV application. I engaged a lawyer, not the property lawyer from before, a different firm, one that handled immigration specifically. She reviewed the documentation and told me the overstay was manageable. The fine would be paid, the record would reflect the settlement, and the SRRV delay was a separate matter that required a response letter with supporting financial documentation. She would prepare this. Her fees for the engagement, 45,000 pesos, approximately 720 euros. I paid it. I also visited the workshop in the industrial zone that week because I had not been in 6 weeks, and Ronnie's monthly report for January had not arrived. The industrial zone in Mandaue smells of diesel and welding fume and hot tarmac, and the side street where the workshop was located was, on the day I visited, quiet. The building was there. The signage was still up. I had paid for that signage. I remembered the invoice. The door was locked. I knocked. Nobody came. I went to the unit next door, a small engineering shop, and asked when they had last seen activity at Ronnie's operation. The man looked at me for a moment and said, 2 months, maybe more. The plasma cutter had been collected by a truck around that time. I called Ronnie. The call went to voicemail. I sent a message. No reply. I called again the next morning. Voicemail. I went back to the barangay and asked Marisol where Ronnie was. She said he was having some difficulties with the business and had been avoiding family contact. She said this in a tone that suggested she knew more than she was saying and had decided not to say it. I think about that tone a lot. I went to my room and I opened the spreadsheet. Monthly reports from Ronnie, 8 of them, modest but plausible. 3 site visits, the operation appeared functional. Then, silence. Equipment gone. 3,200,000 pesos. 50 euros, 000. And a man who had stopped answering his phone. I sat at the desk in the room with the small desk that Marisol had arranged for me, and I looked at the screen, and I thought, I know this business. I will know if the numbers are wrong. The numbers were wrong. I had simply not been looking at the right numbers. I came back from the BI office on a Thursday afternoon in March 2024. The immigration lawyer had submitted the response letter to PRA 2 weeks prior, and we were waiting. The overstay fine had been paid. My tourist visa had been reissued for 60 days. Administratively, things were in a holding pattern. Not resolved, but not actively collapsing. I had allowed myself to believe, during the grab ride back from Osmeña Boulevard, that the worst of it was bureaucratic and therefore manageable. Bureaucratic problems have procedures. Procedures have steps. Steps can be followed. I heard the argument from outside the gate. Gina, Ronnie's wife, was a quiet woman normally, the kind of person who fills a room through absence of friction rather than presence. I had eaten perhaps 20 meals with her at that table, and could not have told you many specific things she had said. So the sound of her voice at that volume, through a closed gate in a barangay, where the houses sit close together and sound carries through the afternoon heat, was immediately wrong. I opened the gate. Marisol was in the compound, positioned between Gina and the house door, her arms slightly out, palms down, a posture I recognized from nowhere and understood immediately as, keep this contained. Gina was not interested in being contained. Tatay Ben was not visible. Nanay Cora was standing near the covered area with her hand over her mouth. The words were Cebuano, rapid, overlapping, the cadence of something that had been held a long time and was now not being held anymore. I stood near the gate and understood nothing except the emotional register, which required no translation. Then Gina said a name, Joel, and then the word anak, child. I knew this word. I had heard Nanay Cora use it that afternoon with the sweet coffee before Marisol had redirected the conversation. And then a year. 2020, 2020. A neighbor had followed me in through the gate. One of the boys from the basketball court, older, perhaps 18. And he was standing slightly behind me. He said in English, quietly, "She is saying Marisol has a child with a man named Joel. The child is 4 years old. Joel lives on the street behind this one." I did not respond. The neighbor said nothing further. Marisol had seen me by this point. The argument did not stop immediately. Gina had things still to say. But Marisol's eyes were on me, and there was in her face something I cannot precisely describe. Not guilt, exactly. Not fear. Something more like the expression of a person watching a structural calculation they have been managing prove itself correct in a way they did not want it to. I went to my room, the small desk, the reasonable internet connection. I opened the spreadsheet. I did not know what else to do with my hands. I sat there for approximately 2 hours. I could hear, from outside, the argument winding down. Not resolved, just exhausted. Voices dropping. A door closing. Silence. And then the ordinary sounds of a barangay evening. A tricycle on the road outside. A television from somewhere. The beginning of karaoke from 3 lots over, which was a Friday tradition, and did not care what kind of day I had just had. I reviewed what I now understood. Marisol had a common-law partner, Joel, a man who lived 4 streets away, locally present, locally known, the father of a 4-year-old boy she had never mentioned across 30 months of calls and visits, and a house I had paid for, and 3 weeks of her annual leave, and a beach near Moalboal, and a hospital waiting room where she had touched my arm and said thank you. The family had known. Gina had known and been uncomfortable with it for months, and had chosen today, in the context of whatever argument she and Ronnie had been having before I arrived, to make it someone else's problem too. At around 7 in the evening, I went to find Marisol. She was in the kitchen. The house was otherwise quiet. Tatay Ben and Nanay Cora had gone to bed, or were giving the appearance of having done so. Neka was not visible. Marisol was washing a cup that was already clean. I told her I needed to understand what was true. She set the cup down. She turned around. She cried. Briefly, genuinely, I think. And then she stopped. And then she told me. Joel had been in her life before I appeared in it. They were not married. The Philippines does not make it easy to formalize arrangements of this kind, and there were complications she did not specify. The boy's name was Marco. She had not told me because she had not known how to tell me, and then she had not told me because time had passed, and then she had not told me because stopping had become its own kind of position. She said she had cared about what we had. She said this carefully, in a way that neither confirmed nor denied what we had actually been to each other. And then she said the thing I have thought about every day since. She said, I was honest about everything that mattered. I needed help. You helped. Is that not also a kind of truth? I did not answer this question. I am still not certain it has an answer. I walked back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. Through the wall I could hear, very faintly, Tatay Ben coughing. The cough of a man whose heart had been repaired with a stent that I had paid for, in a house I had paid for, on land whose title carried Marisol's name and not mine. The next 2 weeks were practical. They had to be. I contacted my immigration lawyer about the implications of the situation for my SRRV application. The answer was not encouraging. The PRA investigation into my financial documentation was ongoing, and the deposit remained frozen. The lawyer said to expect 12 to 18 months for resolution. The $20,000, approximately 18,500 euros at the current rate, was suspended in a process that would conclude when it concluded. I attempted, through the same lawyer, to understand my options regarding the business investment. The lawyer made inquiries. The lease on the industrial unit had lapsed 2 months prior. The equipment, the plasma cutter, the stock, everything I had visited and verified had been liquidated. The proceeds had gone somewhere that was not a bank account associated with my investment. The lawyer advised me that pursuing Ronnie through the courts was possible, but that the cost of pursuit would likely exceed any recoverable amount, given what he had left to recover from. I paid the lawyer 18,000 pesos for this advice, about 290 euros, and noted it in the spreadsheet. Ronnie never answered his phone. Not once. I have thought about this. He and I had shaken hands at that table under the lechon smell, and he had said, I know you will, Kuya. And he had known I would, and he had planned around it. And I am still uncertain whether this makes him a skilled operator or simply a man who saw an opportunity that his circumstances made it very difficult to refuse. Poverty does things to people's calculations that I, sitting in Essen with 290,000 euros, had not accounted for. I also attempted to speak to Marisol about the house, the title, some arrangement. She was not unkind about this. She said the house was where her family lived. She did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. I had known this was the legal reality when I paid for it. My lawyer had told me directly. I had said I understood. I booked a flight to Frankfurt via Manila. I chose Manila rather than flying direct from Cebu because the BI overstay record on my file made the Manila International Terminal the cleaner option for exit processing. My lawyer agreed this was sensible. I settled the remaining outstanding fees, legal costs, the final visa administrative charge, various small amounts I had not yet closed, and transferred what remained in my main Philippine bank account back to Germany. The morning I left, Tatay Ben was sitting in his chair at the plastic table. The same chair. The same table I had paid for indirectly by paying for the house that contained it. He stood up when I came out with my suitcase. He shook my hand. He did not say anything. This also required no translation. Nanay Cora pressed a small bag of food into my hand at the gate. Some wrapped rice, some fruit. Pasalubong in reverse. Food for the person who was leaving, rather than gifts from the one returning. I do not know if she intended this symbolism. I carried the bag to the Grab and ate some of the rice at the Cebu airport while I waited for the connection to Manila. And I thought about how long it had been since someone had given me food to take on a journey, and how Ingrid used to do this. Sandwiches wrapped in foil, even for short trips, because she said, you never know. Ninoy Aquino, International Airport, Terminal 1, May 2024. The departure hall smells of air conditioning and fast food and a particular variety of floor cleaner that I have come to associate, over 30 months, with Filipino public buildings. There is a Jollibee near the domestic connection gates. I do not go to it. I find a coffee shop instead, an anonymous international brand, and I buy a coffee that costs 180 pesos, about 3 euros, and I sit down at a table by the window, and I open my laptop, and I open the spreadsheet. This is, I want you to understand, not a dramatic gesture. It is simply what I do. It is what I have always done. I look at the columns for the last time. House and land, title in Marisol's name, no legal recourse, 30,000 euros. Business investment with Ronnie, equipment liquidated, man not answering his phone, 50,000 euros. Monthly support transfers over 30 months. 28,000 euros. Medical contributions, Tatay Ben's heart, Ronnie's collarbone, Danica's youngest child who used to watch my spoon technique, 12,000 euros. Legal fees, visa costs, overstay fines, immigration lawyer, property lawyer, the 18,000 pesos consultation, confirming I could not recover anything from Ronnie, 9,000 euros. Living expenses during the 16 months I was resident. Rent of my own room in a house I had built, food, transport, ordinary daily life, 31,000 euros. SRRV deposit, frozen pending PRA investigation, returnable in 12 to 18 months according to my lawyer, which means returnable in 12 to 18 months if everything goes correctly, which has not been my experience of processes that require things to go correctly. Approximately 18,500 euros. I total the confirmed losses. 160,000 euros. Add the frozen deposit. 178,500 euros. Call it 180,000 euros in round numbers, which is the kind of rounding that a man who has kept a green ledger since 1989 does not normally permit himself. But I am sitting in an airport, and I am tired, and the precise figure does not change what it means. I started with 290,000 euros. I have 40,000 euros in the secondary account that Marisol did not know about. The reserve account, the workshop habit, the kind of privacy that a man maintains without thinking about it. This is what I have: 40,000 euros and a state pension of 1,400 euros a month and a flight to Frankfurt. I close the spreadsheet. I do not delete it. I will keep it. That is also simply what I do. I call my daughter. Her name is Clara. She lives in Bochum, which is 20 minutes from where I grew up, and she has a husband and 2 children I have met twice, and I have spoken to her properly perhaps 3 times in 3 years, which is something I will need to address. The phone rings 4 times, and she answers sounding slightly cautious, because a call from her father at an unusual hour has not historically carried good news. I tell her I am at the airport in Manila. I tell her I am coming home. There is a pause. She asks if I am all right. I think about how to answer this accurately. I am physically well. I am financially diminished but not ruined. I have the pension and the reserve account, and Germany has health care, and I will not starve or be without shelter. I am not in legal jeopardy. The overstay has been settled, and my record is clear. I am, in the accounting sense, functional. I tell her, not exactly, but I am coming home. Another pause, shorter. She says, okay. She says she will have a room ready. I thank her, and end the call, and sit with the coffee, which has gone slightly cold, and I think about Clara, and how little I know about her life now, and how much of that is my fault, and how little of the 30 months I spent in Mandawa I can justify on any basis that would make sense to her. And I think about Marisol. I want to be honest with you about this. In the same way I have tried to be honest about everything else in this account. I do not hate her. I have tried to construct hatred because it would be simpler and tidier, and I cannot make it hold. She told me she had needed help, and I had helped, and was that not a kind of truth? And the answer is, yes, it is a kind of truth. The medical bills were real. The family's need was real. The warmth in that house, Tatay Ben with his fishing boat story, Nanay Cora with her sinigang, the smallest child watching my spoon technique at the table, was not manufactured. I sat inside a genuine family that had a genuine problem, and I solved it for a time, and the solving of it was what I needed to be doing. And the fact that I was also being used does not cancel either of those things. I think about Ingrid. I think about her with more clarity than I have been able to manage in 3 years. She would have seen all of this, I think, not predicted it exactly, but understood the mechanism of it. She understood me better than I understood myself, which is a thing I knew and did not know simultaneously for 29 years. And when she died, I took all the capacity I had for being known, and I looked for somewhere to put it. And I found a woman on a website who asked about metal fabrication and remembered a date I had not given her, and I proceeded with the confidence of a man who measures things. I measured everything. I checked the hospital receipts. I verified the land title. I reviewed the business plan. I made 3 calls to equipment suppliers to confirm Ronnie's pricing was accurate. I inspected the construction at foundation stage and at wall stage, and found 2 deficiencies and had them corrected. I did not once open a document and ask, "What am I doing here? And why does it feel so necessary? And is the necessity itself the problem?" I thought I was an engineer making a plan. I was not making a plan. I was building another Ingrid out of whatever materials were available. The materials were not the right materials. The Philippines did not steal my money. My loneliness hired it out, and the Philippines was simply where the transaction occurred. I board the flight At 23:40, the aircraft is full. I take the window seat, because I always take the window seat, and I watch the lights of Metro Manila shrink below me as we climb. The sprawl of it, the extraordinary density of human life lit up in the dark. A city of 14 million people managing their difficult circumstances with a resourcefulness and warmth that I have not been able to fully account for in any column. Discarte, Marisol called it once, when I asked what word Filipinos used for the ingenuity of solving problems with whatever is at hand. Discarte. I did not have it. I had a spreadsheet. I sleep for 4 hours somewhere over the Indian Ocean, and I wake up to the smell of the breakfast service, and I think, I am going to Clara's house in Bocum. I am going to sit at her table and eat whatever she puts in front of me without checking the documentation. I am going to ask her about her husband's name and what her children are studying, and whether she still plays the piano, which she did as a child, and which I attended one recital of, and then stopped attending because the workshop had orders to fill. I am going to stay for as long as she will have me, and I am going to do it without a plan. This is, I think, the correct next step. It is not a comfortable step. It is simply the correct one. That was Wolfgang's story, in his own words. I want to sit with it for a moment, before we go. There are things in this story that are specific to Wolfgang. The green ledger, the spreadsheet, the 35 years of measuring tolerances so that other people's work came out right. But the mechanism underneath the story is not specific to Wolfgang at all. It is the mechanism of a person who has lost the thing that organized their life, and who finds something new to organize it around, and who applies all their existing skills to the new project without asking whether those skills are appropriate to it. The practical warnings from Wolfgang's story are real and worth stating plainly. Putting property in a partner's name gives you no legal claim if the relationship ends. Your property lawyer will tell you this directly, and you should listen. Business partnerships with no enforceable signed contract give you no recourse when the reports stop coming. The SRRV deposit is returnable in principle, but if your financial documentation is irregular for any reason, the process of recovering it becomes long and expensive. These are not theoretical risks. They are what happened to Wolfgang. But I also want to acknowledge what Wolfgang himself acknowledged in that airport coffee shop. Marisol's family had real needs. Tatay Ben's cardiac stent was a real medical necessity. The surgery on Danica's child was real. The warmth in that household was genuine. Filipino family obligation is not a scam. It is a deep cultural reality, one that millions of overseas Filipino workers navigate every day when they send money home from jobs in Hong Kong or Dubai or Riyadh. The fact that Wolfgang became the financial equivalent of an OFW for a family he had known for 30 months is not simply exploitation. It is also cultural collision and loneliness and the compounding logic of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. That coexistence, real need and real exploitation, genuine warmth and calculated omission, a kind of truth and also not enough truth, is what makes these stories difficult. It is also what makes them worth telling. If you're watching this, and you recognize any stage of Wolfgang's situation in your own, the transfers that have started, the house in someone else's name, the business investment with a handshake and a document neither party signed, the time to examine it is before the next stage. Not because everyone in the Philippines is a Ronnie. Most people are not. But because you cannot protect yourself with a spreadsheet if you're not willing to apply it to the question of why you need so badly for this to work. Wolfgang is in Bocum. He is, by his own account, not exactly all right. He is also eating at his daughter's table and asking about her children and not checking the documentation. That seems like a reasonable start. Thank you for watching Inside the Philippines. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and take care of yourself out there.